is a multimedia artist who has exhibited at venues including White Columns, Bronx Museum of the Arts, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, as well as international film festivals, including the Cinefable Film Festival in Paris and the Reeling International LGBT Film Festival in Chicago. She has worked for more than 17 years in former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet states through 3 Fulbright Awards, ArtsLink, the Soros Fund for Arts and Culture, and the Trust for Mutual Understanding. With the help of these programs, she built 2 papermaking studios at university art departments in Serbia and Bosnia, collaborated with Georgian women, felt artisans, and activists with Craft Power, a shared project with Miriam Scher, and developed research, documentary, and advocacy projects with ethnographers and intangible heritage experts to protect, interpret, and archive endangered women's handicrafts and social customs. She curated exhibitions including Social Paper, Hand Papermaking in the Context of Socially Engaged Art with Jessica Cochran, the first exhibition considering hand papermaking in a socially engaged art context, and Revolution at Point Zero, Feminist Social Practice with Nisa Page Lieberman, the first exhibition to consider the feminist art movement as the progenitor of contemporary socially engaged art. Her curatorial and recent hand papermaking projects include Seeds and Surface, an ecofeminist project with Book and Paper MFA Maggie Puckett, funded by the Crafts Research Fund, Clinton Hill Foundation, and the Nathan Cummings Foundation. She is currently Associate Professor in the Art and Art History Department at Columbia College in Chicago and Visiting Instructor in the Global Studies Department at University of Chicago. There, she is co-teaching a class at the intersection of hand papermaking and climate catastrophe. Her critical essays have been printed in Bomb, Art Papers, Flash Art, Metropolis M, Hand Papermaking, and Afterimage, among other publications. Help me welcome Melissa Potter.
I have a lot of people to thank, but at first I just want to thank the community here that I met with. Such an amazing group of makers. It has been a really remarkable experience. I want to thank Mark Newport for inviting me here and also giving me a lot of space to think about where paper fits, so thank you for that. And Jennifer, you are the rock and roll superstar of hosts. I have been treated like a queen, and I really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much. This first image is from the Papermaker's Garden at 8th and Wabash in downtown Chicago, and I'll be talking quite a bit about this project as we go along. So I start out with a few images that I feel encapsulate many of the themes and variations around the work that I do. This is an image with the Gorilla Girls, Frida Kahlo and Katie Kolwitz. We embedded them in our papermaking studio and made banana paper with abaca fiber for a broadside workshop that they did as an interaction with my graduate students. And this is a letterpress printed menu card from a performance that I did in the Papermaker's Garden on the history of the location as a brothel in Chicago's Vice District. And it looked at the intersection of women's work on that site as sex workers and gender violence in contemporary agriculture. The paper is made from potato that was grown and harvested in the Papermaker's Garden and was a collaboration with the University of Wisconsin using plants, the vines from potato to consider blight remediation, and it yielded some of the best paper I've ever worked with. I adore paper because it always surprises me even after all of these years. This quote, "A man can catch you in the fields where the plants are taller than you." Rosario E. was the first woman to, as an illegal in this country, to go on record about the sex abuse that was happening at her farm in New Jersey. And then this is a picture of me on horseback with 2 collaborators. One of them is Miriam Scher, the other is an activist from Georgia named Ida Baktorizhde. These are felt masks made from research that I conducted on an ancient ritual cult tradition that takes place at the border of Dagestan and the Republic of Georgia, both former Soviet states. These masks were made as sort of a fertility rite to protect for crops and the fertility of their women. The idea was to scare away the devil. So we invoked that as a way to offer activists anonymity, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But throughout my career, my goal has been to collect and record the stories of women, particularly those that are endangered, either by neglect or by war or social scenarios. And all of my work is feminist in scope. And feminism came to me from my grandmother, actually really from my great-grandmother, who participated in the suffrage movement in the United States. But my grandmother was a Wolf scholar and a painter and a printmaker and also an OSS operative who worked on the Balkan desk during the Second World War. So she gave me feminism, but she also gave me the Balkans. And so while I lived with her in college, we sponsored a woman named Zena Spratcho, who was a refugee that had moved from Bosnia to Croatia. And I actually was able to reunite with Zena, who was repatriated to Bosnia in 2015. But I call my grandmother really my psychogeography through that space. It took me a long time to connect the dots, but there she is. This is a letter that Zena sent us in 1995 from her camp in Croatia. And so I started actually traveling to the region in 2000 after the NATO bombardment. I was part of a small group of Europeans and Americans who went back into the country after it had been very heavily sanctioned. And it was also at a time in American history where there was a concept around democracy building. George Soros, who has come under some criticism for what has been described as sort of a neoliberal agenda about rebuilding this region, funded this area very heavily and brought artists and thinkers and makers into the region to collaborate with people to rebuild a society post-war and also post-genocide. The image you see here is from the siege of Sarajevo, which was the longest siege in history since World War II. So I was so taken with this region. The first person I met there said, "You will be back." And I said, "How on earth am I going to do that?" And it's been 33 times since. So it became really an obsession. This is a map, one of my many maps, but all the little pink and yellow dashes are all the villages that I started looking at and researching. And what I found was there was an incredible wealth of intangible heritage, from weaving to textiles and local gender rituals. And I started collecting and inventorying and observing these different rituals. And because paper was something that I did, I was invited to the Faculty of Fine Art in Belgrade to build a studio. And what I started recognizing is that it was really a socially engaged project, working with a group of people who had been so badly sanctioned during the war that they literally had nothing. I mean, what we're making paper with here is a blender from somebody's kitchen, trays for photography. There wasn't even plastic. It's hard to even imagine what life was like there during the sanctions, but finding materials was really hard. So this idea of somebody coming from the outside and sort of repurposing things and offering a new mode of interpretation was very powerful for them. And so we traveled around in what became known as the papermaking circus, and we went to lots of different locations throughout the country, some small, some faculties. And what I realized was, as I was sort of participating in this generation of a new group of artists who really had kind of lost hope after the war's end in the mid-90s. And so we started just cobbling things together. And the ways that we cobbled things together were from phone calls and grandma's attics and kitchens and begging, borrowing, stealing, a lot of supplies that came from green markets, which are very popular in the region. And overall, this has been one of the most formative experiences of my life, really thinking about the ways that I can build a studio, work in that studio, and engage with other people to interpret a medium. This is a student, this was an amazing experience. The little fatty on the left is my son, who had his first birthday in Sarajevo with me. And then the person on the right is a student who's doing these huge paperworks, and I said, wow, that's so cool. He wanted a studio visit, and I was like, wow, that's so cool. So where did you learn paper? And he looked at me like, are you crazy? I was in your class in 2000. But, you know, it was 15 years later, and here he is, and he had sort of carried that forward. So to me, this was just a really interesting study in the way all of you will make an impression on someone that you just can't even imagine what it will be, you know, in 15 years. And so as I deepened my relationship, I started working with the Ethnographic Museum, which is an incredible repository of women's work and intangible heritage. And I partnered with Sasha Srečković, who's a curator and also an intangible heritage manager for the UNESCO program. The UNESCO program works on behalf of cultures internationally to catalog, record, archive, protect and preserve, and ultimately try to reinvigorate disappearing cultural traditions from around the world. Many countries have suffered tremendously the loss of their intangible heritage due to industrialization. In this region, it's largely due to communism, because communism really subdued or sort of broke down the interest in traditional labors and things that were considered more nationalistic. So what started out with paper and fiber and textile research grew into lots of interviews and research with different artisans throughout the region. This is a very famous project that took place during the Bosnian War. This is Beba. She only goes by Beba, of Bosfam, which is Bosnian family. She was actually a mathematician, and she decided to develop a system of interaction with women where she taught rug making even to people who had lost that tradition in their family. And ultimately, what you see behind the backdrop there is a large-scale rug that records the names of people who had been killed during the Srebrenica massacre, and it's one of the largest memorials in that region, made entirely with textiles from women who had lived together in the camps and came together under this auspice of Bosnian family making rugs together as a healing practice. So I continued working in the region, and I started this thing where I was working on different sides of the war. So I started my career working in Serbia, and I also started my career there where it was not really all that thinkable to go over a border, right? You could fly into Sarajevo, you could fly into to Belgrade, but to cross over from one of those locations to the other was not really something that was all that possible. And it became easier as time went on, but I started working on opposite sides. So my most recent work in that region was in Bosnia, and Bosnia, of course, the siege was from the Serbian army. And I designed a project in the Papermaking Studio. And I also, as I mentioned, reunited with Zena in her very small village of Grapska, which is about 2 hours north of Sarajevo. So this project at the Academy of Fine Arts in Sarajevo, I collaborated with the person who built my papermaking studio in Serbia, named Adam Pantic. He's an incredible chef, and I designed a project called Pulp and Pastry. He is an expert in pastry-based cooking and specializes in the Bosnian region because he did his military service in Bosnia. And so we decided to create a project where I would be making paper and he would be making pastry with the same materials. So we led this workshop where paper and food was inspired by old Bosnian recipes. And I gathered the materials from the Central Green Market. This is the Mercal market, which was bombed during the war. More than 60 people died at this location. One would never know except for a memorial there because it thrives, as green things do in this region, because it's considered one of the great bread baskets of Europe or Southern Europe. And so we collected materials that were good for paper making. Many food-based materials are great for paper making. So leeks, garlic, certain types of skins for dyes, cabbages, all those things also good for the local PETA. I found a regular supplier, and that regular supplier, interestingly enough, was a Serb who was still living in Bosnia. Most of the Serbs had left that region because the ethnic lines became very delineated again. But so I thought it was quite interesting that the person who was providing me with my vegetables was actually a Serb, like Adam. And we spent days practicing our recipes, which also became this sort of social, movable feast where we would bring different people together for these. I probably gained 15 pounds in a week, testing out all of these different pita recipes and paper recipes and drinking rakia and having conversations. And it actually was quite serious because, Adam, this guy who's a Serb, not a lot of Serbs still go back to Bosnia. So Bosnia used to be considered a melting pot of the region, but after the war, again, things were very delineated. So Adam coming was a big deal. He hadn't been there since he was a very young man, 20 years ago. And the conversations between Bosnians and Adam was also an aspect of the performance that I could not have anticipated, but informed a lot of my conversations that would appear in the work that we were doing in the studio. So I built another studio, also recognizing that basically a papermaking studio is a domestic space. And we set up so that we were both working in tandem. And we invited more than 100 people into the space to come and work with us, to eat and to make paper with us. And so what we were doing, we recognized that paper and food have a lot of the same characteristics for carrying family stories. And so I interviewed people as they were making paper about their relationship to food and also specifically about their regionally specific foods. What I found, which I couldn't have anticipated until I started doing these smaller charrettes with Adam working on our recipes, was that food was totally mediated by war, that basically the generations had relationships to food based on dearth, based on the siege. And young people who were maybe 25 and under had relationships to food that was dearth, but in a different way, that basically their society had transformed and they no longer grew certain things like strawberries. So there were all these recollections of what strawberries were like before industrial farming really took hold in that region. So it was generationally, it was nuanced based on generation. It was also very much mediated by generational experiences of war. And so ultimately I produced a series of poems that were risograph printed and distributed, taking all of these different interviews and weaving them together as a story about what had taken place there with this project. And it was really at the time that I came to the Center for Book, Paper, and Print in 2008 that this idea of printing, I've been trained as a printmaker traditionally, because there really wasn't paper making at the time where I was attending school. But so these ideas around print as a way to build an archive and to distribute and to think about what I was actually recording really kind of exploded for me at the Center for Book, Paper, and Print. This is our letterpress studio. We have 6 Vandercook presses. I wasn't trained as a letterpress printer, but I started doing a lot of research on the LA Women's Building and the early movement that took place there to create a parallel pedagogical space, a women's pedagogy that was called Feminist Art Pedagogy, and also an alternative archive. There was a graphic arts center at the LA Women's Building, and they distributed multiple with the idea of repopulating libraries, of rethinking the materials that enter the discourse, and in response to the exclusionary places that were art academies at the time. And what I also realized as I continued my research is that many of the places like Center for Book and Paper have their roots at the LA Women's Building. So there were a number of schools like Mills College, Kathleen Walkup at Mills College, Susan King, who went to New York, and they populated the landscape nationally. My goal right now is to trace our history at the Center for Book, Paper, and Print back to the LA Women's Building. I know it's there. I'm going to find it, but I'm continuing my dig. Marilyn Sword, who was our founder, sadly died very much too young at the age of 61, I believe, a number of years ago. So this is a photograph of our papermaking studio, which I still, after 11 years, walk into this space and take photographs. And that, I worship this space. It's an amazing space, singular in its, in the way that it thinks about paper as interdisciplinary media. And so this is my studio, the place where I spend most of my time. And through the various media, we have letterpress, book, and paper. And through these various media, I started digging into the locational histories, the history of Marilyn Sword, which had been completely unrecorded until very, very recently, and also the locational histories of our founder. Her name was Mary Blood. I've told Columbia College if they want to improve their PR campaign, they should just rebrand as the Blood School of Art. I think that would fix probably everything. Mary Blood was a fascinating woman who opened a school of oratory, also a very under-recorded person, who was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and I've started developing a number of semi-fictitious, semi-historical narratives about her connection to the site of the Papermaker's Garden, which was in the maw of the Vice District, where there were more than 65 brothels in that area. So I started developing these narratives and intersecting them with the things that were grown on the location of the Papermaker's Garden. In this case, Velvet Queen sunflower, which we renamed the Lizzie Shackley Velvet Queen sunflower, which we populated back through seed banks. And a few years later, I was very happy to receive Lizzie Shackley Velvet Queen sunflower back in my swap. But this idea, too, of recording these histories that have never basically been told and intersecting them with a larger conversation around the downtown Chicagoland area, really through the stories of women. Other methods, because we are also a very material-oriented program, and we still teach a lot of hard hand skills. So I started learning them right along with everybody else. Pulp screening, cyanotype box making, risograph, laser cutting, ultimately felt making. This was a box that I built that became a book for the activist project I did in Republic of Georgia. This is the bunny mask that you saw in the earlier picture. And then, felt, which really caught my heart and soul in a very interesting way. And I think that there was a good reason for it, which is that it's a water-loving medium. And I think even though my hands are about to fall off from cracking, I love having my hands in wet things and manipulating wet things. So, this is the Jersey Devil. This was my sort of alter ego that I developed for the project. I'm, by the way, from New Jersey, and there is this thing called the Jersey Devil, which is basically our equivalent of urban legend about the devil that comes to steal your crops and ruin your life, right? We also, Columbia's program is very strange in that it's my program, Book and Paper, is married to a new media program. So, at Columbia, we love to mash up the weird with the weird. So I started collaborating with my colleague, Paul Catanese, who's a new media artist, on a project called Handmade Media, where we were designing handmade speakers and papers that would encapsulate things like L-wires, speakers, connectors. It was an interesting project, and I ultimately was happiest with these pieces that were based on a lot of the rug research that I had done in Serbia and in Republic of Georgia. So these pieces were named after Craft Power, which was my project in Republic of Georgia. These are now in a traveling exhibition. Also, as makers, there's always this incredible challenge, like how do we ship and manage the things that we make? Don't even get me started on what it was like to frame and move these suckers around. It's been a thing, but it's worth it, right? It's totally worth it. So alongside of these projects, I recognized that I was engaging with people in a lot of, first of all, I was making my work, but I was also engaging students in understanding the potentials of these media, which there are only a few papermaking programs nationally, and there's no papermaking program that's married to a new media program, and creating a discourse that would support that. So I started recognizing these different avenues for my work, and one of them was a real investment in pedagogy and designing programs that would invigorate the students' experience with media and at the same time bring me into conversations with things that were deeply about the work that I was doing. And so this is, for instance, a collaboration I did with Laura Anderson Barbata. I call her my art muse. I've been working with her for more than 20 years and include her in every show that I've ever curated. I think she's one of the greatest socially engaged artists alive today. And this project was about Julia Pastrana, who was a Mexican national who was traveled as a circus freak, as the hairiest woman and ugliest woman in the world. She was a mezzo-soprano opera singer. And Laura, over 10 years, repatriated her remains from Oslo, Norway, where she died and where her remains languished in a basement, and did a ceremony for her in her hometown of Sinaloa. I'm really proud of myself. That's the first time I've told that story without getting some tears going, because it's a very moving, the whole project was really intense, the way it engaged also the Mexican community. And so she has a series of zines that dig into these questions. And the question that I designed for this zine with my students was the intersection of women and animals, and in specific, simianization, which intersected with a conversation my campus was having on race. And so we had the People's Institute on our campus to talk about undoing racism. And so I wanted to talk very specifically about simianization, which is humans as being interpreted as apes. And so each student contributed to the zine interpreting this theme, and we had a long bibliography that was a reading project that was embedded in it as well. Allison Knowles, who was one of the first people that I worked with in our studio, she is a paper lover. There's like a whole following of artists who just loves on the paper, and she's one of them. She has a series that are called bean turners that she constructs out of overbeaten fibers and plays them like instruments in this spread. And my charge for this offset printed book with Sarah Ranch House Press at SAIC was to make an instrument on the inside of the book, which was 2 pages of overbeaten abaca with lentils in them that rattled when you moved the pages. So she wanted to have like a performative part of this offset book. And probably the most substantial relationship that I've had in terms of an evolving pedagogy is with Shernawe Hakehiwe, who is a Yanomami indigenous leader from the community of Pori Pori in Venezuela. Laura Anderson went to work with him in the early 90s, and I featured her work with Shernawe in my first exhibition called Among Tender Roots, which featured Laura's work. And the Venezuelan government was so excited to have Shernawe's work featured that they brought him to Chicago. It was the second time in history that a Yanomami had left that community to come to the United States, and for sure the first time that a Yanomami had come to the city of Chicago. It was an extraordinary project, and for 3 years I had him work with my students to interpret his language and symbol systems from the Yanomami community into a series of handmade paper works. What I learned was, because all roads lead back to feminism for me, is that these symbol systems come from his mother. So I recorded him talking about the ways that they record their symbols, which is mostly on their babies. And so they do a lot of protective drawings on the babies with the anoto root, which is good to resist insects, but It also is their symbol system, which very much like rug making and certain types of weaving incorporates protective symbologies. This is a leopard. This image is a leopard in the woods looking through, and the leopard is a very protective symbol in Yanomami culture. Yanomami community members do not make a distinction between history and fable. They live in a universe where those things are all part of the same thing. So I don't refer to them as stories, I refer to them as his history, because that's the way they're understood in Yanomami. Now, this project was successful enough that he is traveling all over the world and has been participating in biennials with this work. So it's been very exciting to work with him. And the Venezuelan government then brought 2 of my graduate students and me to Caracas to develop a project interpreting Yanomami stories with 10 of Venezuela's print and top printmakers and painters. It was really interesting. We worked in an outdoor studio, pulping fibers from the Amazon, and created a limited edition with stories about Poreawe, who's Banana Man. It's one of their historical references. It was a really fun project. We were there for a month, and it was quite transformative experience. So again, as I went along, I realized that I needed to do more work in curatorial, that basically I had this opportunity to frame a conversation. And so I curated with Jessica Cochran, who was our curator at the time at Center for Book and Paper, social paper, hand paper making in the context of socially engaged art, which really looked at this intersection of paper and social engagement, and made the argument that paper making has been socially engaged for 35 years and has not been incorporated into the socially engaged movement, but now it's time, especially in the city of Chicago, which could arguably be considered sort of ground zero for social practice. So this became a very important part of my practice, to sort of create the ideas or solidify the ideas around the things that I was making. This is a piece by a student, Tricia Martin, who worked with women in the Philippines to create a series of saleable objects from paper made from regionally available paper-making fibers. This is a traditional Filipino sari-sari store, which she brought into the gallery, and has continued this project with them. So as I kept going at Columbia, I continued my interest in the Balkan region, and I came across the Soros Fund for Arts and Culture call, and my friend Miriam Scher, a bookmaker who's one of my favorite collaborators, I said, felt. So I started doing some research, and I was like, felt, because I was like, I want to do this felt. And it's also the intangible heritage practice of this region, Tusheti, which is a beautiful national forest in the western part of the country. And she said, we can make books. And I said, I think we have a winner. So we designed a project to do a skill trade where we taught bookmaking and the women taught us felt making. So we partnered with this group of women. We also partnered with the Women's Fund in Georgia, which was a very interesting feminist organization that helped us network with these craft artisan groups. What was haunting and something that we needed a lot of interfacing for was that the region has a 92% domestic violence rate due to many different things, and one of them is thought that the stress and pressure of joblessness in that region has led to a huge problem with alcoholism. So these women are really under siege in a lot of ways, and so we partnered with people that would help us do the proper type of interfacing, not wanting to sort of parachute in. This is Lily Mertashvili. She's one of the last practitioners and purveyors of this form. She informed me that these slippers can cure stage 1 and 2 cancer. Someone might want to call the Northwestern Hospital and let them know. But what I actually think is, it's probably the symbols. So I start digging down into these symbols which become ever present in the work of that region. Probably at some point those symbols were considered curative and restorative, and that's probably really what she's talking about. Here are some of the women that we were working with. We worked with at 4 locations. They're professional studios that are set up specifically for felt making. They're considered safe places for women to work. They do have domestic violence and projects that go in to help the women develop safe zones. They also have like 1-800 numbers. It's places where the outside organizations can come to interface with them, and they sell their work. And so in the ideal scenario, they are selling their work for profit, which helps their families, obviously. These are pages from one of the books. This was a traditional and a city Georgian woman. Very complicated in this region, the ideas around self-actualization and individuation. It was working in Georgia that really taught me in many traditional societies the idea of being asked what you think or what you want or how you want to be thought of is quite alien to these people. And so that also required some interfacing. But this was a woman's story about her dream to be on the stage. She had wanted to be an actress. So over time, we developed this project called Feminist Felt. So I asked my collaborators, like, well, you know, we're working with these women. Why don't we try to make something ourselves? So we designed these banners. She designed this little book called Feminist. And so we started iterating at each location these banners. And this is with our Equal Pay for Equal Work series. This was photographed in a credit union. So we would sort of stage them and photograph them in different locations. This is a detail of that piece. I absolutely adored writing with felt. It's something that I've continued to really enjoy doing. It's very, very free and very interesting way to work, and also surprising because it transforms as the material transforms. And then on our second trip, we worked in feminist consciousness-raising methodology with activists in the city who were under siege, working in the public sphere doing public protest. And so we wanted to design a way for people to have a bit of anonymity, kind of akin to the way the guerrilla girls go out and nobody knows who they are. So we worked with all of the activists to design masks for themselves. These are, again, from the ritual tradition of Berikoba, which comes from the Tusheti region. I studied in London learning about that ritual tradition from him. He's like the only person who's sort of the collector of this kind of material from Dagestan, the border of Dagestan and Republic of Georgia. And here they are actually at work. So, you know, these were great and fun and interesting in theory, but they actually were put into practice. The woman on the right was on TV with her mask, which was great because some of these women were experiencing death threats. A couple of them had to leave the country. This is for a protest against virginity testing. The Republic of Georgia, like the Balkans, has done a return to religious fervor. It's sort of a reaction to a post-communist high market capital society where there actually are very few jobs and opportunities. So the Orthodox Church has really cracked down on sort of traditional expectations of women. These signs say, hymen experts come and be counted. I am not a hymen, and virginity examination is horrific. And so the idea that these women would be able to go out in public as who they were was kind of unthinkable. So this transformation of the public space and their, you know, allowing them to do their work in this manner was something really quite interesting and exciting for us. And here are three of the felters who were carrying banners during the first International Women's Day, which took place in 2013 or 14, one of those. It was a monumental day. The idea of feminism is so late to this country, and it's still in its very formative stages. And so we made a decision, probably one of the better decisions I've made, to leave all of the banners with the activists, which was very hard for me to do, having made a lot of them in collaboration. And it was definitely the right thing to do because they trotted them all back out and marched with them. And I thought, you know, who could possibly ask for anything better than these objects being marched in public for the first successful International Women's Day? Shortly thereafter, there was an LGBTQIA March for Idaho Day. Some of you might be familiar with Idaho Day. It's an international day for the LGBT community. The activists had to be evacuated by the United Nations. And after that point, one of the main activists left for the United States and has not been back. So it is really dangerous to be an outspoken activist in this area. So, book continues to be a repository and a space where I'm, again, building an archive, building a space where I can bring an interdisciplinary engagement to this. I interviewed the person in London, Robert Chensinger, on his research on the felt traditions. We interviewed some of the activists that we worked with. We wrote our stories and our diaries about, what took place, and we published this book, Craft Power. There was another one for the first iteration as well, and done as a print-on-demand publication, but it simultaneously provided portfolio documentation to the women. So we made sure that every single woman that we worked with got a copy of the print-on-demand book for her work moving forward in creating her own repository. So after Republic of Georgia, I opened the Papermaker's Garden with my graduate students, and it was sort of accidental tourism in the sense that there were 10 beds. This only shows 6 of them. There were 10 beds, they're huge. And I had 7 graduate students, and I thought, 10 minus 7 is 3. So there are going to be 3 beds that have nothing in them, and I better get cracking. So I asked one of my alumna, Maggie Puckett, who shares a lot of interest in ecofeminism and the environment, what we should do. So we founded this project called the Seeds in Service Project, which was propagating seeds for our artistic material in hand paper making. And so our seeds are sourced carefully from specific locations. Our first seeds came from the Jane Addams Hull House, which is a settlement house. Those women conducted a wage study of the location of the Papermaker's Garden. They're the ones that recorded the 65 brothels in what I considered to be one of the most radical acts of the early 1900s, which was basically a declaration that sex work is work, but they didn't have any more parameters than that other than to simply record them. So this idea of partnering with seeds and growing materials that could then animate the ways we tell those stories was very powerful to us. We then started partnering with other heirloom and non-GMO providers, the Zapatista community, the Experimental Farm Network, and Seed Savers Exchange, where we studied how to do seed saving. It's a slow process. One of the things I experienced being in people's studios, it's very hard to help people understand the time that it takes to make things. Sometimes paper is not a fast process, particularly when you're growing it from scratch, but this is basically a full cycle. We grow, we dream in the summer, we tend, then we collect, and then we beat and make and produce our materials and our artworks. And then the cycle continues. So it's a continuous cycle. So our space is very limited. The stakes are obviously high because lots of things can happen. There can be problems with material. There can be problems with things like powder mildew. There can be problems with wind. So, we're constantly in dialogue and conversation with a catastrophe, which is the changing climate that's affecting the way we do our work. But we come up with themes around the gardens, and so each garden receives a theme. This was one that I designed after a lot of work around women's bodies, feeling like I wanted to turn my attention to pleasure and the radical concepts around pleasure, that plants could be used in a way that was pleasurable. So this one, Plants of Pleasure, is dedicated to offering pleasure to women whose bodies, personal lives, and economic choices are under siege by global fascist forces. As the primary caregivers and second-class citizens of our society, there is little, if any, time for women's sheer and simple enjoyment. So through smell and experimenting also with plants that could technically be used for recreational purposes, we planted a garden on this theme, and this is very similar to the themes that we do around war, ecofeminism, and women's bodies. We also do a ton of research projects that come off of those gardens. So this one came off the Bosnian magic garden, which was one of the first image that I showed. I got obsessed with SCOBY, and I got obsessed with it partly because I started reading the work of Larisa Jasharovic, who's my collaborator at University of Chicago right now. And I designed a station in our papermaking studio for students to experiment with this material. We then had someone from the Illinois Institute of Technology who wanted to experiment with it as paper, which was like random. So we started beating it and turning it into paper as an experiment. But I was really interested in its metaphoric property as much as anything else. And so Larisa wrote a book on the anthropology of kombucha in the Balkans. And she says, the mushroom remedies casually traverse the polarized borders of former Yugoslav states as simple items in an informal economy of gifts, medicine, and advice that negotiate logistical hassles rather than ideological hurdles. And it was pretty much there that I fell in love with Larisa Jasharovic and her incredible mind. But so I was very interested in the way that this sort of generative, rhizomatic space was very indicative of the kinds of philosophies I had around collaborative practice, material feminism, and multiple sort of bacterial/bodily spaces that we all share. And I used it for a lot of different purposes. I manufactured it for the show that I did, Revolution at Point Zero, for the Nieta sisters who were doing performances with it. And they did performances about traditional medicine and its intersection with Puerto Rican allopathic medicine, which is kind of removed homeopathy from that region. So these large scobies were part of the installation and also part of the performance that they did for the show. And so SCOBY also ended up with this. This is an intervention that we did for Art Paper magazine, where we were asked to do like a few page spread. So we interact in lots of different ways, some of them through our gardens, others through events and projects. And this one, we did a parallel study of the paper making for the paper that Art Paper is printed on, in combination with our paper making technology to produce a piece of paper out of mushrooms. So we started with an Art Papers magazine featuring Theaster Gates, who's arguably the progenitor of Chicago's social practice movement, grew mushrooms and then made paper from those mushrooms, and sort of dove into the politics of manufactured paper and the concepts around sustainability, which, by the way, are all manufactured ideas really by corporations. These are public programs. We did tea events, public projects where we would design and develop things for distribution. These things all came from the Bosnian Magic Garden, and I did them in collaboration with a woman who is from the Chicago Bosnian diaspora, who helped me curate the teas. And Food, Sex, Death, which was a culmination of the research on the women in the region who had worked on that site as as sex workers. The menu from the card that you saw earlier was a 4-course meal exploring different issues around agriculture and intersecting them with these histories. Pre-colonial man-killer Sagamite stew, Rosario E's vulnerable squash melange, and with each course we narrated a story of that location at the turn of the century. This is a photograph of Maggie Puckett drawing they became tablecloths. This was made out of Velvet Queen sunflower, which was the Lizzie Shackley Velvet Queen sunflower. And so I'll finish up just by showing a few things from the latest work that we're doing. We are producing a print-on-demand book, which is now over 150 pages long, which charts, it's one part manifesto, one part how-to guide, one part research, one part artwork. So, we really wanted this to be sort of a culminating project for us, where we went through all of the different gardens, And this is our war garden. We talk about the different things that we propagated there, where they ended up, the artworks that were made with them. This is a spread from the Women's March, where we made books. They were made, if anybody's familiar with the drumleaf binding, they were made with sheets of paper that were glued together, so they had multiple banners within each one, and we used them at the Women's March, and Chicago, boom, totally did it hard and better than anybody else. We had, like, I think the largest number of people were protesting that day. It was freaking amazing. So this was a very fun project. And then most recently, my work with the University of Chicago, and I met Mark this summer at Haystack. And Haystack is an extraordinary place, as many of you know. And it offered me the opportunity to really stage an idea. And that idea is built on larger ideas about how can we narrate through the plants in our environment. And so I prompted the students to think about the ways foraged materials could tell a story about that place, and using different avenues of field research methodologies like interview and observation, botanical drawing, to build narratives. It was a whole lot of fun. And so I basically developed what I call the interpretation of Haystack in paper, where each piece of paper is narrated around where it was found, who we interacted with, what happened, maybe an event that took place. And so when I started deepening my relationship with Larisa Yasharovich at U of Chicago, we developed something quite similar, which is using the materials that are available in the Chicagoland area to work on a project with students to describe the end times, basically to talk about climate catastrophe. And so this class is engaging students in designing their own narratives. The Global Studies program is an interdisciplinary program which is very artistic in its scope. This is me at the Lurie Garden, which is a restoration project, a prairie restoration project, growing indigenous and endemic plants to the region. And this year they decided to partner with us to let me collect their material, which I've been experimenting with the University of Chicago to pulp this material. And these are things, some of these things are also here on the campus, like red switchgrass was one of them we talked about. Rattlesnake Master. I mean, they all have such great names. Little Blue Stem, the names are just absolutely amazing. And so I brought all these into the Papermaking Studio and have been asking these fundamental questions. So the questions we ask as part of our sort of polemic, I think of us also writing a manifesto. What do plants have to tell us about devastation and remediation? From tuber to petal, bud to pollen, can we capture the plant's remedial propensities of making do, getting over, and making better through the storytelling of papermaking craft? In retelling the plant's tales, how do we at once demythologize the lore of the folk that surrounds them, whether or not they are Western or modern, and reanimate the botanical common sense of either resourcism or conservationism? Two scholars, teachers, and friends, a multimedia artist and papermaker, and a cultural anthropologist experiment with telling plant tales through paper, handmade from plants and storied letters, collecting weeds from sites of post-industrial abandonment in post-socialist Bosnia and in post-Fordist North American Midwest, brambles from the new wilds of Bosnia's former front lines, and bee-friendlies from small apiaries, the collaborators write up, cook up, pulp down, and reform the vegetal into paper documents of plants' expressiveness. They propose a material way of retelling plant tales by bringing to the fore a viscous assemblage of the soil-nurtured fibers and the historical, ecological, and speculative modes that render the plants knowing. And these are the students, the University of Chicago students coming into the classroom to make scrolls, which they're gonna write their end tales on. And so finally, from a common wild carrot that in Bosnia stands in for the world in peril, to acacia that overgrows minefields and overflows with nectar, except when weather is weird, to milkweed, which is what this piece of paper is, once common to the Midwest, a staple diet of the birds in the plains. End Tales asks, what stories can we tell for the sake of a multi-species present at stake in the post-sustainable moment of a runaway climate change? And so that's the end of my talk. Thank you.